So in the last video on the smartphone, Ditch Your Smartphone Part 1, we started just to talk about some of the negative effects of the device. And we know that those negative effects are legion. But we talked about just a couple. So one of them was just the fact that the phone is really designed, the smartphone is really designed in such a way that it's going to make it very difficult for you to have the richest social interaction. So we talked about that. And then we talked about how in the spiritual life, just on a very basic level, the constant checking of the smartphone, the constant knowledge that something might be there, makes it very difficult to have this simple presence of God, this simple kind of gaze on God. So that's kind of where we left off on part 1. So in part 2, what I'd like to do is now get into excuses. The excuses to keep the smartphone. Some of the most common ones. And our goal today is basically to debunk them. And so I hope that hope it's convincing. So, but before we do that, just a few points I want to make. So one, I don't have a smartphone, just for clarification. It would be pretty bad if I did have one making a video like this. I did have smartphones for a number of years, but this is the guy that I have now. It's a piece of junk, more or less. It was like $60. It's glitchy. Any group texts, you have to literally manually download every single one. Yeah, it's pretty annoying. But fortunately, if you ever make the plunge to get rid of your smartphone and get a dumb phone of some sort, luckily there are quite a few on the market, even just very modern ones, you can say. Ones that actually are very well made, well constructed. So you don't have to settle with the piece of junk. I'm pretty sure that I will upgrade to something a little bit better at some point down the road. So that's the first point. And just really quickly, the story of how I stopped using the smartphone. So I had dumb phones or flip phones since up to about 2017. And then I got my first smartphone, which was a hand-me-down. And then when that one died, I got a second hand-me-down. So basically I never had to buy one. And then towards the end of the life of my last one, I kind of was interested in the idea of, maybe getting a dumb phone, maybe just take the plunge and do it. And the hand-me-downs were kind of over by that point, and so if I got another smartphone, I'd have to actually buy it. And buying a smartphone with your own money, I don't like that. So, but what happened basically was the phone more or less died. It didn't completely die, but it was just not working. And stupidly, I didn't back up all my files. Some were backed up just over the internet, but others, like voice recordings, things that I recorded, not everything was backed up. So what happened was I asked my friend, how could I get this maybe to work so I can get the files off of it? And he suggested, well, maybe it's overheating. Maybe the battery's overheating. So, put it in the fridge for a bit and then take it out and see if that helps. So I put it in the fridge, and it actually did help it to go on for a bit, but then it just went off again. So long story short, basically what ended up happening was, well, you know what? Putting it in the fridge worked a little bit. Well, why don't you put it in the freezer? And then it will really work. So that's what I did. I put it in the freezer, which really cooled it down, you might imagine. And I took it out and I tried working it. It worked a little bit better than the fridge, but it still wasn't enough. So basically what happened was I had the phone sitting in the freezer, and then I plugged it in and I had a little wire coming out of the freezer going into my computer, and I was trying to get the files up as fast as possible. And the most frustrating thing was, it's 90% done, and then, disconnected because the phone died again. So it wasn't a very pleasant experience. It didn't leave the best impression of the smartphone for me, even though it really wasn't the smartphone's fault. But in any case, I just decided at that point, I made the decision, I'm just going to buy a dumb phone. So that's what happened. So next point I want to make, and this is more relevant to the actual topic here. We basically have to convince ourselves that getting rid of your smartphone is not just, it'll improve your life a little bit. It'll be, a little bit beneficial. No, we have to really be convinced, I think, that getting rid of your smartphone is actually a substantial change in your life. A substantial improvement in your life. In fact, so substantial that for most people, if they don't get rid of their smartphone, they are really they're not living the best life that they can. They're not living the life, I think, that God intends for us. Smartphone is a recent invention. It's a very modern thing. And it's taking a little bit of time for research to mount up to see exactly what it's doing to us. But I think that if any of us just looks at the general public, and if we have a smartphone, I think it's pretty easy for us to conclude, just if we're being honest with ourselves, that this thing is not doing anything good for us. Not absolutely speaking. There are some good things that the smartphone can do. But overall, it's doing it's taking a toll on us. It's making it extremely difficult to live a natural human life, let alone a supernatural life. So that's super important, I think, to establish before we get to the excuses. Because if we're not convinced that this is really important, then we'll rack up the excuses. And sometimes they seem to be pretty legit. All these inconveniences without the smartphone. And you put that in a huge pile and it says, well, that's pretty overpowering. If we're not convinced that the negatives of the smartphone are this big and that they far outweigh all those, individual little inconveniences here, if we're not convinced of that size, then we'll say, well, it's way too inconvenient, so I'm just not going to think about it. So that's really important. We don't have time to really go deeply into it here. I highly recommend the SSPX podcast series on digital dangers with Father Kopek. Absolutely phenomenal. Well researched. It's not just ranting. And Father pulls no punches. Okay, I think it's time for us to just be point blank with ourselves and just say the reality of what this technology is doing to us, while still being charitable. So it's a very good series. I highly recommend it. What I'll just say here, just very, very briefly, is how do we know that I'm using my smartphone to the extent that I should get rid of it? I think there's just two simple things we can say. One, are we using it for hours a day? And if we are, I don't think we need to think too much about it. If it's either hours a day, if we can't stop doing it for hours a day, I think that is pretty clear to us that it's probably not something that we should be keeping. And if we can't rack down the hours, then we should do some serious thinking about that. But the other one, it's not as obvious as that perhaps, it's the number of times that we check it. We've talked about that a little bit. It's not just a question of, I spent an hour and 40 minutes today on the smartphone. You could spend 50 minutes on the smartphone a day and yet still be very, very damaging to your life. Why? Because if you momentarily check it multiple times an hour, even if it racks up to just 50 minutes a day, that constant checking is doing what we said before in the previous video. It's destroying our ability to think. Thought requires time, attention. If we're constantly bombarded by these stimuli, by these notifications, messages, etc., then forget about presence of God and forget about just normal human life. So the constant barrage of notifications and messages and just possibilities, everything that can be in that device that we can keep checking, that's a very damaging thing to our psyche, everything. So I think that's also, even if it's not that long, that much time a day, if we're doing that relatively often, very consistently, I think that's also a reason to say, this is not good for me. So that's that. And I would say now the third main point is this. There are legitimate cases where someone can say, I cannot get rid of the smartphone. Not because I am addicted to it necessarily, but because I need it for my duty estate. Now that is totally possible. I know people who have to have their smartphone who don't want it. In fact, they tried to get rid of it, but they had to take it back because of their job. So here's the deal. How do you know if you actually really do need your smartphone? The answer is this. If you can imagine yourself at your judgment, looking at Jesus Christ, if you can say, Lord, I needed that nefarious device, I needed it in order to complete my duty estate that you gave to me. So if we can say that, then I imagine that our Lord will say, okay. And so if that's your situation, then this video is not really directed towards you. Your video, whether it's a future video I make or just or the SSPX one, that's very good. Your video is, how do I minimize the damage that the smartphone might do to me? I mean, we're talking about blockers, we're talking about accountability, we're talking about, putting it away somewhere when I don't need it for work anymore, things like that. So that'll be kind of what you should be thinking about if you're in this situation. So that's the third point. There are legitimate cases where someone really does need it, but let's be careful not to abuse that idea. We're going to see now the excuses, because again, we can say, I need it for X, Y, or Z, but if you don't really need it, and some people, I think, they can probably do without it more than they think they can. But if you really do need it, then God bless you. All right, so let's move on to the excuses. So what are the most common ones? Number one, I need the GPS. Okay, let's start with this. If the smartphone were the only way to get the GPS, then I would not have been making this video, because I would have a smartphone. Luckily, smartphone is not the only way to have a GPS. You can buy a GPS. That's what they used to do, and that's what you can still do. So I've got not one, but two. I got two GPSs. All right, so they're both in my car. So if you're afraid, well, if I buy one, what if it dies? Well, what if your smartphone dies too? But anyway, what if my GPS dies? We'll buy two. Buy two, and it's virtually impossible that both are going to die on the same trip. So you shouldn't have any problem getting to where you need to go. And is it worth spending the $80 or so to buy separate GPSs? I mean, this one was like $60 on eBay. This little tiny one was like 25, $30. So, is it worth $80, $85? Well, if it's going to significantly improve your life, allowing you to get rid of your smartphone, I think it's worth the money. Now, last thing, I need Waze. Well, okay, I need Waze. If you don't know, Waze is a smartphone app that through the users using it and making note, it tells you where the cops are with pretty significant accuracy. And that's very useful. Okay, I'm not gonna lie. But assuming that the smartphone is the only way to get Waze, is that sufficient justification to have the smartphone, considering the cons are this big? Is having Waze going to outweigh that? It's very useful and very nice to have, but maybe just drive a little bit more safely. At the end of the day, if you drive more safely than you would if you have Waze, objectively that's a better thing. It's kind of annoying, but yes, it's a better thing. So no, I don't think that Waze is a sufficient justification to have to keep your smartphone. Okay, so there's that. What else do we have? I need a music and a podcast player. Okay, well, we don't live in an age where other audio devices are obsolete. They still exist. They're still made. You could even use an older smartphone if you wanted to as a music player. All right, so that's not a sufficient. Just because it's convenient to have it all on one device doesn't mean that that's necessary. Okay, so there are other options out there. But the other thing I'll say is this: it's not always necessary when you're driving or when you're out walking, for example. It's not always necessary to have music or a podcast playing. Sometimes it's good to just, think. Or undistracted, just observe reality a little bit. I love listening to music and I love listening to podcasts. All I'm saying is that objectively, how much does it really help our lives? It's probably useful for us to do a little more thinking and a little less listening to a lot of these things. And so that, again, is not a justification to have a smartphone. What's number 3? I need a camera. Okay. This is a pretty good reason, a pretty good excuse. Smartphone cameras they're amazing. So it allows you to take pictures everywhere because you can have your smartphone everywhere with you. Okay, so that's nice. I would say 2 things. One, you can get non-smartphones that actually have some pretty decent cameras. Okay, they may not be the top of the line camera that you have on a top-end iPhone or Galaxy, but they're still going to be good cameras. It's not necessarily going to be this garbage camera that I have on here. All right. So there are ways to have a phone that's not a smartphone, but that has a very good camera. So that's number 1. Number 2, though, is this. Is it possible that not taking pictures of everything might be good for us? I mean, back in the day, people didn't have the ability to take photos of everything everywhere. Is it possible? Is it possible that our lives might even be improved by not having the ability to take a picture every time we see something interesting? Is it possible that just looking at it, thinking about it, marveling at it, is it possible that just doing that instead of immediately pulling out the camera, can that actually be better for us sometimes? I think it can. I think that we're in a camera obsession age. So there's two things. I don't really take a lot of pictures anymore with the phone. Sometimes I really wish I could, but for the most part, I don't even really think about it anymore. So there's that. And then there's the fact that you don't need a smartphone. You could get a dumb phone, but there are dumb phones out there that are very well made that have good cameras. So I would say this is not a justification to get the smartphone. What else do we have? I need my smartphone for when I travel, when I fly. So I don't know all the ins and outs of, the argument here. I think people just say, well, I need it to scan my, my boarding pass. And, to that I say, well, there's a thing called a printer. And when you press print, it prints out your boarding pass. And if you print two of them, you can put one, in your pocket or whatever, and then one you can fold up in your wallet, so that it's virtually impossible for you not to have your boarding pass with you when you get to the boarding pass area. So you don't need to scan it with your smartphone. You can print it out. In a way that's almost more reliable because you have a physical copy of it. And, the smartphone, you never... it's unlikely that your battery dies right at that moment, but there's that chance, So all I'm saying is that it's not unreliable to have a physical copy of your boarding pass instead of, the image on your phone. So that obviously is not anything essential as far as I can see. Now, what if there are changes to your boarding pass? Well, I believe you can just print them out at the airport. And if you're already past security and there's a change or whatever, I believe that you can get it just printed out at the help desk, where you board. So I don't think that's a concern. Now, what if you somehow need the internet to do things with your flight? I don't know why I would. Usually, flight notifications come through as text messages. So presumably you have a phone, even if it's not a smartphone. But if you really need the internet, then pull out your laptop. I think that's fine. Most people travel with their laptop or an iPad or something. So if you don't have a smartphone, you absolutely need to access your app or your account or whatever. I guess you can use the laptop. But anyway, I don't think that there's any real absolute need to have the smartphone to travel smoothly. I haven't really had any problems traveling with a flip phone. So if there's anything I'm missing, maybe there is a need, but as far as I can see, there's not really any. Okay. What else do we have? I need different apps. Let me say this. So anything less than an absolute need of an app is just not going to fly here. Okay, so if you need an app, you need this app and it's only available as an app for your work, okay, fine. Or I need it, I'm in college and I absolutely need this app, otherwise I can't pass the course or whatever. Okay, make it work. But outside of stuff like that, believe me, I know there are some very interesting apps out there that do very interesting things. I personally miss my Lewis and Short Latin Dictionary app. That was a time waster. But outside of necessity, I don't think that we can justify the cons of the smartphone with this app is pretty useful for this or that. If you absolutely need it for some reason, okay. If you need an app, okay. But for the vast majority of us, I think that if we actually look at every single app that we download and we say, do I need this? Do I really need this? Does having this app outweigh the con that I know the smartphone is for my life? And I'm pretty sure most of us say, no, it's not. So that's that. Last of all, I may need the smartphone in an emergency. Okay, so this one I would say is maybe the strongest argument someone could make. So if you're in an emergency situation, time matters, seconds matter, minutes matter. Is there something about the smartphone that could, where those minutes could matter when it comes to the smartphone? I don't know all the possibilities. You can still dial 911 with your dumb phone. You can get a non-smartphone with the GPS. You could even get a non-smartphone with internet. So again, I don't know if maybe there's something that the smartphone can do that no other phone would be able to do, where in an emergency situation you would need the smartphone. It's possible. I can't really think of any personally. 911 you can dial with any phone. GPS, if you need to run to the hospital, you don't know where it is, okay, get 2 GPSs. Okay, but even if you don't have that, get a non-smartphone rather, with a GPS. So that's a GPS. So there's 911, there's GPS. Do you need internet? There are some non-smartphones with internet. In fact, this thing has internet, believe it or not. It's very useful if I want to use it as a hotspot, or if I just I'm on a long trip and I want to hear a podcast or something. Well, then I can do that. But it's so clunky that I'm not tempted to waste time on the internet on this thing. So that's the advantage of something like this, where there's internet, but you're not really going to be using it outside of a couple of very specific things. So, for example, an emergency. So I don't see, there might be a case, but I don't see a case where you would have to have a smartphone to take care of an unknown or uncertain emergency that could happen. So that's going to be pretty much your judgment call and not mine. But again, 911, GPS, internet, if you really need it, you can get all those without the smartphone. So how do we conclude this discussion? I would say this. Getting rid of your smartphone is not magic. If you still are addicted to the screen, which many of us, I'd say the majority of humans are, I'm too addicted to the screen. All right. Getting rid of the smartphone is not going to be something magical. There's still plenty of other screens that you can still waste your time in front of. But what's so beneficial about getting rid of the smartphone is the fact that the smartphone is the most accessible, the easiest to waste your time, and to lose, again, that human element of observing the world around us, of thinking, of contemplating. The smartphone is the one that does the most damage in that regard. That's why it's so crucial to get rid of it. I mean, you can spend a lot of time on your computer, but if you're not near your computer, if you're out somewhere at a party or whatever, well, the benefits of not having a smartphone. You don't have to worry about awkward moment, no one's talking. Let me just swipe my phone for no reason whatsoever, right? That's the most awkward moment. So that goes away when you don't have a smartphone, and similar cases, right? So I would just say that we have to be convinced that the smartphone cons are this big, and that even if you rack up all these inconveniences, in my judgment, I don't think that they add up enough to outweigh the cons. So, as in after the first video, I encourage you to consider the possibility of getting rid of your smartphone. If you don't need it for work, if you don't need it for school or whatever, I strongly encourage you to think about it. And you can try it, you can go back. But I recommend that you try it and see what happens to your life. See what happens to your ability to observe reality around you. It really changes a lot. So I'll leave you with that.